Hello and welcome to this video where the subject is the histogram and the clipping warnings. As we work through these videos, one area that's going to be very important to us is the histogram. It looks a little bit of a mystery sitting up at the top right in the Adobe Camera Raw window, but it's well worth our attention. The histogram gives us a graphic picture of the tonal range of the image, and I always say we can think of this just like we think of our satellite navigation in the car, because the histogram is going to guide us to the editing sliders we need, like exposure, highlights, shadows, whites and blacks. It just takes a little time for us to get the feel of the histogram. But if you take a look at it every time you open an image to start the editing process, and you use it as a guide, you'll be surprised how quickly you become accustomed to it. The histogram is actually pretty vital to us when we're actually shooting our images as well, but that's not the subject of these videos. Now, when we look at an obviously well lit and exposed image, the histogram forms a mountainous shape that rises high and touches both the left side, the shadow areas, and the right side, the highlight areas, and the middle is the midtone. So in the image of these rocks here, both our histogram and our eyes are confirming a well exposed image. But what can we expect to see if we take a picture that contains predominantly light tones? Now if you look up at the top right of the screen, you can see that the histogram is all stacked up on the right hand side. The right hand side is where all the light pixels are, and then we look at the picture and we can see the correlation between the two. I suppose there's a couple of ways where we would see pictures where the tones are likely to be light. One of them could be the content. This could be a snow scene. But what I've done here is squeezed a lot of light into the sensor, but although the image looks pale, it's not overexposed, and I can tell that instantly by looking at the histogram. If it was overexposed, I would see a straight edge on the extreme right hand end of that histogram. I'm going to move up to the exposure for this image, and I'm just going to increase it. Dragging it to the right, if you look at the histogram, you can see it reflects what we're doing. So as the image does become overexposed, you can see a straight edge on the light tone pixel side of the histogram. Now what Photoshop also gives us is what it calls a clipping warning. We have one for highlights and we have one for shadows, right up at the top left and the top right. If I click to turn the top right one on, there you can see along the top, but mostly over on the left, that colour is telling us that we've got no pixels there at all. We've blown out all of the detail, and it's actually telling us we've moved the slider too far. If I go back to the slider here and I double click it to reset it, you can see we lose the clipping warning. So although it's still turned on up there, Photoshop is saying you've actually got detail in the sky at the top left. Yes, it looks quite bright here, but there's detail there. When we move our cursor up into the histogram, you'll see a shaded area pop up, and just below the cursor and just below the histogram you can see the word exposure. When I move to the right, it's saying this area really controls the highlights, and this side the whites. So we're okay on that side of the scale. When we come to this side of the scale, you could argue that maybe we need the shadows tweaking just a little bit, because this histogram should reach the left hand side, and we're certainly missing some blacks here. So it's giving us an idea of what we need to do with the sliders below. Chances are the changes we want to make here is probably a little less exposure, and look how that histogram grows, and look at the detail coming in the sky. we may want to increase the shadows a little bit and the blacks, as I said. And within a few seconds, with a bit of colour and a bit of clarity, suddenly the image is coming alive. The histogram gave me a good guide on what I needed to do and how much I needed to do it. Now, when an image opens up into Camera Raw that has predominantly dark pixels, then we see the same sort of thing in the histogram, but in reverse. Now we can see the peak is tucked up on the left hand side. And there's a couple of reasons we may see that. We've got the circumstances here where there's perhaps a little bit of underexposure in this image, but this was part of a bracketed set of 3, and this one has got the least exposure of all 3. The other reason, of course, we could be taking a picture of a black cat in a shady corner, and then the histogram would be telling us much the same. So the histogram is always a guide. We don't follow it blindly, but it's a great tool to use. Now if you look up at the top left of the histogram, you'll see I've got the shadow clipping warning turned on. You can see it, that little box highlighted in white, and that's what's giving us the blue areas over here. And what Photoshop is saying here is much the same as it did with the highlights. It's saying that these areas here are blocked up and are completely black. There's no detail in there at all. So if we really needed to raise detail there, and I'm not sure we would do in a picture like this so close to the edge, but if we did, we could be looking at shadows and we could be looking at exposure, and before long we can almost remove them completely, and what's left is insignificant. But you'll also notice that as I've moved those sliders to talk about the shadows, we're just beginning to see some burnout of the highlights in the middle of the image. Now I find in practice that I can accept blocked up shadows far easier than I can accept overblown highlights. So the histogram really is the Sat-Nav for image editing, because it tells us what to do and to some degree how much to do it. Now of course, if the histogram is a graph of the tonal range of the image, then there's obviously going to be a correlation between what we see in the histogram and what we see in the image. If you allow the histogram to guide you for most of your editing work, after a short while you will start to understand what you see, to the extent that there comes a time when even if you didn't see the image and you could only see the histogram, you'd still have a good idea of what you needed to do when you got the image open into Adobe Camera Raw. If you come along to my website at the address currently on screen, you will find I have an extensive set of videos on the subject of camera craft. That set of videos is designed for the user of a digital SLR, but also other cameras too, and that also includes a video on the histogram, but from the point of view of the camera and the skills we need up to and including when we press that shutter button.